Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza of the COVID-19 Cyber Threat Coalition here, and today I'm joined by a very interesting guest, and I'm very much looking forward to talking to him. This is Sam Visner. Now, if you don't know who Sam is, he is the Director of National Cybersecurity federally funded Research and Development Center at the MITRE Corporation. And Sam, thank you so much for joining me today.
Nick, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, no, pleasure's all mine, believe me. I love these kinds of discussions, especially with an organization like MITRE. And speaking of them, can you tell our audience a little bit more about yourself? And also, can you kind of explain MITRE for those of us who don't know what it is?
Sure, happy to do that. So first, about myself, I'm the director of, as you said, the National Cybersecurity Federally Funded Research and Development Center. I've been active in the cybersecurity and information security fields for many, many years. I came to MITRE in 2017, having run a couple of cybersecurity businesses, one focused on research and development, the other focused largely on global managed security services. I've spent a good deal of time as well in the private sector as chief of signals intelligence programs at the National Security Agency. So I've been in both government and in industry as an executive. I teach as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. I teach a course on cybersecurity policy, operations, and technology in the program on science and technology and international affairs in the School of Foreign Service. And I'm a Georgetown undergraduate alum, so Hoya Saxa, and I took a degree in international politics, and I took a degree in a master's degree in telecommunications from George Washington University, just about a mile or so down the road. So I've been involved in cybersecurity one way or another for a number of years, and that it's really sort of what I do. I'm on the board of directors of the new Space ISAC. I'm on the cyber committee at the Armed Forces Communications Electronics Association and the Cyber Council of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance. So in the cybersecurity and national security fields, I'm somebody who has been really devoted his professional life to it. And the area in which I'm working right now is interesting. It's really the cybersecurity of the nation's business infrastructure to enhance the economic security and economic competitiveness of the United States. MITRE, which is the company for which I work, is a nonprofit founded in 1958. To work solely in the public interest. And as I said, it is a nonprofit. Its principal line of business is operating research and development centers for the government. But as I said, it's its own corporation with its own board of trustees. And it operates, as I said, solely in the public interest. That's all it wants to do is to support the public interest. And the company's motto is building a safer world.
Wow. Wow. So that is one heck of a resume. So yeah, that's very cool. You've clearly been in cyber. I always think I've been in cybersecurity for a while, but wow, that is beyond impressive. That is really cool. And I find MITRE to be just fascinating. I've known about you guys for some time, but as I was telling you earlier, I had no idea that you guys weren't actually a government agency until recently. So it's really interesting to see that intertangling, if you will, of those two things.
Sure.
I think it's really cool.
And Nick, in this case, I'm speaking as a MITRE employee under, not certainly as a government employee, which
Right.
I'm not.
Of course, right. And my only expectation here in just this conversation is you being you. I obviously no representation of government, but it's interesting though too, especially just given your time in cybersecurity. I think we're living in unprecedented times with the whole COVID-19 and coronavirus pandemic and all of that. And I think that's raised some interesting challenges for the cybersecurity community. Just having to deal with insecure remote workers. We're all being forced to work from home and all of that. Can you give us MITRE's perspective on this in terms of the federal agencies that MITRE is closely tied to?
Well, I think the real question is, what kind of cybersecurity do we need in a time like this? And things are really sort of unprecedented. We've not faced, a medical emergency quite like this before. And we also have, as a nation, a much bigger attack surface than we've ever had. We're
Yeah.
going to be rolling out more and more devices, the Internet of Things. People talk about eventually a density of IoT devices of maybe having 1 million IP addresses per square kilometer. And
Mhm.
I can't speak for that number, but I can see actually how that might happen as you take a look around your own home and or a factory or a school or an office building or a government agency. So the attack surface has grown. In addition, we found that our own social media and our own personal lives and professional lives depend on an information technology ecosystem that is also kind of an attack surface. So we've had to learn how to build good cybersecurity around both traditional information systems and information systems that didn't exist many years ago. We didn't have a social media cyber ecosystem 10
Right.
years ago. I mean, we had little bits of it, but we didn't have anything like what we have today. We didn't have a cyber ecosystem around the thermostats in our house and the devices that are going to regulate railways and pipes and valves and pipelines and connected vehicles on the road and medical device and connected devices in hospitals like infusion pumps.
Mhm.
We didn't have that. And of course, we're operating in a broadly distributed way. Many of us are operating from home, as you, I think, are right now, and I know that I am. So one of the questions that we have one of the questions that we have to face, and a challenge that we have to face, is that more than ever, we as individuals need to take personal responsibility for cybersecurity. A government agency or a large corporation or a nonprofit can put in place as much of its own infrastructure as it can and put in place security processes and procedures and requirements and train people. But in the end, it's up to us as individual people to practice good cybersecurity hygiene, to use the controls that we've been asked to use, that we're required to use the tools as we've been instructed to use them, so as to make sure that we don't undermine this cybersecurity. There are a couple of things that concern me right now. One is that we are going to be more dependent on the medical infrastructure of our country than we've ever been. And that medical infrastructure will include making sure that patient records are secure, that information about clinical trials is secure, that information about vaccine and treatment research and development is secure, that the information that moves to and from connected devices like infusion pumps or ventilators is secure.
Mhm.
So that is a large and highly distributed cyber ecosystem that wasn't built initially with cybersecurity in mind. Now, there are some standards, HIPAA standards for privacy, which can help, but fundamentally it's large, it's distributed, it's not managed in a centralized way.
Mhm.
And one of the things that concerns me about this infrastructure is ransomware. There is a report that a company in the UK that does clinical trials of new vaccines had their data encrypted. Now I'm told they have recovered. But ransomware against a hospital, ransomware against those who would be undertaking clinical trials is an enormous challenge. There are ways of meeting that challenge, and I'll talk about them. Another challenge is, as you say, the question of social media, attempts to undermine confidence in science, in undermine confidence in the use of data, undermine confidence in the institutions that are trying to, that with which we're all working, that are trying to protect us, undermine confidence in any one of our institutions. And social media is an area that has grown so quickly that I think we're only now in the last year or so really exploring the best ways to protect ourselves in the social media infrastructure.
Mhm.
What does this have to do with COVID-19? Of course, what it has to do with COVID-19 is we want to be sure that we have confidence in the medical institutions and in the national medical infrastructure on which we depend. And we want to be sure that we can have confidence in the data that we're using to develop treatments and the data that we'll be using to develop vaccines. And when the vaccines are available, we'll need to have confidence in the whole infrastructure for their production and for their distribution and for their administration. and to be able to monitor, their efficacy. Those are, and we're talking about essentially rolling out a medical infrastructure to treat over 300 million Americans as swiftly as possible. So I think these are both interesting and difficult challenges. And without speaking for the government, I'm pretty sure that people in government are watching this very carefully. At all levels, particularly our healthcare infrastructure, it's a challenge not just at the federal level, at the national level, but at the state level and at the local level, and at the level of individual hospital administrators who are trying to balance, Nick, the resources that for patient welfare and patient welfare, for making sure that they have doctors and nurses and technicians and orderlies, and that they can have an adequate supply of drugs and an adequate supply of medications and medical supplies, and also cybersecurity. And none of these are unlimited. So for for people at every level, they have to optimize a decision every day, every minute, that doesn't give all your resources to everything. So that's, I think, is a tough national challenge.
Yeah, no, and I would agree. And I mean, there's a lot to unpack that you said that I am sitting here drinking your Kool-Aid on. I do a breaches of the week video every Sunday, just rounding up the breaches that I can find, Google research, or people send me, and it has been getting longer and longer. And to the point of the frameworks that we have in our life, whether it's HIPAA or NIST or whatever that is, I find one that I'm glad to see that these are living documents, that they are trying to adapt as we are expanding and shifting the technology to IoT, and as you were mentioning before, and other things as well. But I also know that one of the other issues that we have, especially when it comes to the institutions that are supposed to be applying HIPAA, like let's say the hospital systems of the world, it oftentimes, as you mentioned, is hit or miss. You have some people that take it very seriously, that are investing, hard and soft dollars in their technology, the defense thereof, as well as training and education. And I find that some organizations just pay lip service to it, as well. When we go in and do cybersecurity assessments against a HIPAA or like a NIST 800-171, oftentimes we are finding a lot of the controls are lacking there. And I think the media and social media for the issues that we've had with, let's say, hyperbolic articles or just downright misinformation. I literally did a video yesterday on 5G conspiracy theories that are now spreading to the United States and all of that. The one thing, though, that I will give the media credit for in this sense is that because they are reporting on the massive breaches of the world, I think that the organizations that we are relying on, those institutions that we are depending on, are actually starting to take notice of this. Less people are paying lip service at the institutional level than I think ever before. And I think that's a very good thing. I think everybody needs to get on board. If you've got an elderly parent in your life, how hard it is to just get two-factor authentication enabled for them, and have them use that, let alone have, people in an institution that are saying, okay, now we have to put in all these controls that might potentially slow us down at a login, but hopefully let us work while defending us. I mean, it's a huge, huge thing that we're dealing with here.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's not easy to build a homogeneous distribution of good training and good practice that's at a high level. That's a tough thing to do. And this is the United States is a complicated place, right? It is the federal republic with authorities at the federal, state, local, tribal levels. Mm-hmm. Things are not entirely consistent. Having said that, there are a couple of things that I think are promising. I've been in the cybersecurity business for a good long time now, and I will tell you that increasingly people are not just paying lip service. When I talk with commercial organizations, when I've talked with companies who are in the telecommunications business, companies that have to deal with sensitive data, with sensitive network data or sensitive personal or individual data, they really want to know, what vulnerabilities do I have? What threats am I facing that might attempt to exploit those vulnerabilities? What are the recommended controls for my industry, and what are the requirements? Mm-hmm. And what's a good way to do this? So one of the things that we are beginning to see, in fact, more than beginning to see, is more serious attention being paid to it. And one thing I will tell you is that I think the the cybersecurity industry in this country and among our partners is trying very hard to meet this challenge. I suspect you've been out at the RSA conference,
Yep.
where literally thousands of companies show up. Some of them have really innovative solutions and are doing really good work. But here's some trends that I'm seeing, not just beginning to see, but I am seeing them. One, the move to cloud, which I think was in some ways cost-driven, is now being modulated very heavily by security. And cloud service providers are making good security one of their differentiators. In other words, hey, I'm not telling you to buy my cloud service because it's cheaper. Buy it because it's a good value and it has good security. That's a change in the conversation, and it's one that I would welcome. The second thing that I would say is that companies are trying, slowly perhaps, but trying to bend the cost curve in the direction of affordability. Not every company is going to be able to spend $1 billion or $2 billion on the cybersecurity of their infrastructure. Maybe you are a regional hospital chain in Illinois or Alabama, and you are operating, a set of small hospitals on a regional basis. The amount of money you can spend on cybersecurity is limited. So we're beginning to see what I would think of as efforts by the private sector to make cybersecurity solutions more affordable. Particularly, we're beginning to see managed services providers try to move in the direction of affordability. We're also seeing the publication of some very good recommendations and controls. Both NIST and DHS have put out good recommendations, and in the case of NIST, very specific recommendations and architectures to be able to improve defenses from and strengthen the ability to recover from ransomware. So there's been a demand to take cybersecurity seriously at all levels, and I think the private sector is more than beginning to meet that challenge. Now we have some challenges that are emerging, and frankly, I think are going to bear even more attention. We're going to have a global 5G environment. Yes. That's coming. It's coming in the United States and it's coming globally. That will provide for far more direct connectivity of IoT devices. And as a result of IP version 6, we're going to have a virtually unlimited, not absolutely, but virtually unlimited number of IoT devices. Right. I think 1 times 2 to the 128th, which is a really big number.
Huge.
Number of devices that potentially we could have. So the combination of a global 5G environment and perhaps even a satellite-based environment, as companies like SpaceX put up hundreds and eventually tens of thousands of satellites, and IoT devices that are going to be built that will comprise together very complex infrastructures that will be mediated, be spewing a lot of data that'll be consumed by artificial intelligence algorithms, which in turn will manage those data, whether or not they're road resources or electrical power resources or medical resources or surface transportation resources in a region or in a city. That's going to be a much more complex infrastructure with a larger and more complex attack surface than we've ever seen before. And that means that we're going to have to develop cybersecurity solutions that scale up to these problems.
Right.
And so we'll have to ask, what are the cybersecurity vulnerabilities of systems that use artificial intelligence? What are the cybersecurity vulnerabilities that might be exploited on an IoT environment where you have literally 1 million IoT devices per square mile or per square kilometer? And oh, by the way, can you use AI to improve your defenses, to adjust your defenses dynamically, to detect anomalous behavior? Right. So there are enormous opportunities for great research and development. There's one piece of really good news. If you're working in cybersecurity now and you're bored, that shouldn't happen. You shouldn't be bored.
No.
You can be worried, you can be happy, but you shouldn't be bored.
Well, if you're bored in cybersecurity, I think you're being complacent. And complacency is the death knell of the cybersecurity industry. In that sense, and again, I'm sitting here just nodding my head, through all of this. The cloud, for example, that we now, since 2017, the polling done by the Cloud Security Alliance, the CSA, has said that businesses are now more trusting the cloud than on-premise infrastructure, and I think it's for good reason. But one of the things that I usually counsel my clients that are not in, let's say, tech or cybersecurity, is to use cybersecurity and the controls they're putting in place in their marketing, in their sales, as they are going after their own customers, and all of that. And I think that's something that a lot of verticals are missing the boat on. And in terms of 5G, I actually wrote an article for Forbes on that, called "Why 5G is going to Get Us All Hacked," and it's talking about, I think, a lot of the challenges that we are seeing with 5G. There's going to be companies that are going to make that financial decision to say, why should I have a traditional perimeter, a traditional wired network, and why don't I just put everything on 5G? Well, that may, especially on the small to mid-sized business side, start knocking off the traditional firewalls and the traditional defensive capabilities that we typically build into a standard network. So how are we dealing with that?
Well, I think
it's just a fascinating topic.
Well, Nick, you raise a great point. 5G represents not just an evolution of broadband architecture, it represents a new kind of architecture.
Yes.
It represents an architecture that is fundamentally different from what we've dealt with before. All right, so yes. The bad news is we're going to have to understand very quickly and very thoroughly the cybersecurity implications of the kind of direct interconnectivity with 5G slices. There's some good news, and that is perhaps more than any other evolution of broadband and internet technology, cybersecurity is being taken seriously by 5G architects.
Yes.
Organizations like the 3GPP are looking very carefully at how to secure 5G slices and making better security intrinsic to intrinsic to the adoption of 5G. And I think, based on what I'm hearing and based on what I'm seeing, that effort is getting a lot of serious attention. Yes. Another thing that I think is worth considering is that even 5G architecture is not fixed. The concept of the O-RAN, of essentially virtualizing the radio access network, may also provide additional opportunities to secure 5G networks. And these are things that hopefully I'd like to see. I want to make a point that that your discussion of cloud made me think of a few minutes ago. I think traditionally we've invented IT architectures and capabilities and then tried to play catch up in developing the cybersecurity capabilities necessary to secure them. This is in essence saying is I'm going to roll out the latest model of my car, and next year I'll improve the brakes. Which is not, which is actually, there's an historical precedent for that, but I won't bore you with it. I think what this tells me is that from a national perspective, research and development on cybersecurity needs to be coupled more closely and synchronized more closely with research and development of information technology. We shouldn't be developing and deploying a technology and securing it 18 months later. The good news is that maybe for the first time in a long time, those working on 5G development have gotten that point. People in places like the 3GPP, for example, I think are working hard to make cybersecurity a component of the architecture as organically as possible, instead of saying we'll come back to the factory in 18 months and we'll put better brakes on your car. Right. I've called for, however, a national cybersecurity research and development strategy that is whole of nation. What we did, for example, in fighting HIV/AIDS was a whole of nation approach. And my impression is that it was in many ways successful. What we did as a nation in essentially achieving dominance in aerospace technology and getting to the moon was a whole of nation approach. It wasn't just the government doing R&D or parts of industry doing it or one or two academic institutions or coming out of the Second World War. My dad was on the Manhattan Project And I was born in Oak Ridge, Tennessee after the Second World War. That was a whole of nation approach to creating, to mastering the science and technology around nuclear energy. I think that kind of whole of nation approach is something that we should be insisting on now. If you've read the recommendations of the Solarium Commission, you'll know that the Solarium Commission tends to look at cyberspace as a national resource, and that our approach to cyberspace should be one of a whole of nation approach. I would extend that to research and development such that we're not playing catch up either to our adversaries or even to ourselves in the deployment of IT.
Right. And I would agree with that. I can't tell you how many times that, when I've been working with, let's say, with a software development outfit where, they're calling me in or my outfit in to go ahead and do, an assessment of what they're doing. One of the recommendations I always have is when you are developing, you're going to need somebody that's going to make that interface beautiful that people are going to want to use. You're going to need that, software engineer that's going to optimize the bandwidth, ensure that you've got good session traffic going. But you need to have somebody developing cybersecurity controls right into it from the start. And you bring up the car. The car is the perfect example of this, and I've used it multiple times, not on the tires or brakes, but on the radio, the head unit, as it becomes a car area network, integrating in Bluetooth and all of that. I used to drive a 2010 car, and every time I would go back for the 3 to 5 years that I drove that car to the dealer, I'd say, do you have an update for my radio? Do you have an update for the Bluetooth? No, they never did. Once it rolled off the factory floor, the manufacturer just washed their hands. I don't care if it's Ford or Ferrari, they were all doing it. And I think, and that's one of the reasons why I'm a fan of Tesla in this sense, is that they're one of the first companies to say, we're going to update the car. We're going to push it, updates to the interface, not just for the AI, for the driving, but we're actually going to harden that. How many years did I go with a vulnerable Bluetooth in my vehicle because it was an afterthought? And it's something that we don't think about. And so you, again, are preaching to the choir here, when it comes to this kind of stuff.
I had an incident like that myself a few years ago. Quite a few years ago, I purchased a car, and I purchased one of the newer Mini Coopers. And I needed to bring it into the dealer for something relatively routine. And this was, I think, in 2003, 2002 or 2003. And the dealer said, by the way, while we had your car in, we updated the operating system. And
what?
16, 17 years ago. And my response was, you did what? And they said, well, yeah, the engine, the fuel injection, all of those systems have software. It has an operating system. So while we had it in, we plugged your computer into our computer, which was plugged into the factory's computer, and we updated the operating system. You'll find that it'll run a little more smoothly. And I said, great. I have to say, it wasn't clear to me at that moment in time that I should be thinking about the cybersecurity of the operating system of my car. But it later did become clear that connected vehicles, which is an area that I think is going to be a domain that will be unleashed by 5G, right? We're going to have more and more things in our cars, in our vehicles that will be connected to each other, to other vehicles, to the road infrastructure, to the regional surface transportation infrastructure. With 5G, there'll be more direct interconnectivity at higher speeds. I think understanding the implications of this, and that data will be spewed out by these IoT devices. It will be consumed by AI applications, which in turn will help us regulate those devices and mediate how those devices are used, for example, in the surface network. Little did I think in 2002 that I was seeing the beginning of that revolution, but we're really beginning to see it now. And I think that's, if we get it right, it'll be great. If we get it right.
Yeah, and it's interesting because my experience traditionally has been, I don't drive a Tesla, for example, but virtually every car that I've had in the connected era, has never really had an update. from a traditional manufacturer. And, so I'm wondering if, Mini lost a lawsuit, or made the calculation of cost versus performance, or, something like that. But I think that's really interesting. And to that effect, I mean, one of the things that I've talked about in the past is we are going to build a coast-to-coast network that is going to allow these vehicles to be integrated, and we are going to create a standardization for the AI, for the driverless car, and all of that. And Google wants to be that, for the record. I think they want to do that whole thing. But that I literally could talk to you on 20 minutes on that alone. But I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the COVID-19 Cyber Threat Coalition, because obviously we have been tracking the explosion of coronavirus phishing lures and all of that. And I want your perspective on this, because there is no doubt that the sectors that MITRE is involved with and that you guys are helping are also seeing these kinds of threats as well. Now, you mentioned that you are on the board of an ISAC and other things, but is there a coordinated effort at this level, just going back to the pandemic real quick, that MITRE is working on, or that you're seeing for sharing threat intelligence?
There's several things that we're doing. MITRE is part of a COVID-19 information sharing coalition, which while it has a cybersecurity component, is about creating a broad scale information sharing environment for COVID-19 research, development, and treatment at a national level. Mm-hmm. That's one of the things that we're doing. And certainly we want to be sure that there's good cybersecurity in information sharing, because if the information environment is in any way polluted, people could lose confidence in it, and that could set back research, development, treatment, and getting the country through the current medical emergency. Mm-hmm. The various ISACs, I think, tend to be focused on specific industries, but the ISAOs are looking at cross-cutting infrastructure. And therefore, the ISAOs, I think, are looking at threats and problems that are common to any industry. I'm on the board of the Space ISAC, which represents a new growing sector of the national and global economy, and is, I think, sort of earlier in its journey than some areas in terms of understanding the cybersecurity implications. In terms of what we're seeing, Nick, as MITRE started to work on cybersecurity many years ago, but in more recent years, we've been worried about essentially social media in particular. MITRE rolled out a capability called SQUINT, or Social See Something, Say Something, S5 or SQUINT, that was rolled out in support of our election security initiative. As you know, the election infrastructure is very complex. You have voting machines, tabulation machines, election night reporting systems, voter registration systems, e-poll books. All of these systems need a certain amount of, not just a certain amount, but need a high level of cybersecurity. But among the things of which we were concerned, of course, were social media attacks that might be used to undermine confidence in the national infrastructure or misguide people, tell people that a voting station is closed and they can't go there when in fact it hasn't closed, or tell people that, hey, if you're over 65, go home, you'll get an absentee ballot tomorrow.
Right.
Which wouldn't necessarily be true on election day.
Right.
And could be used to conceivably suppress the vote. So SQUINT allows one to, if you see something on social media or some media that doesn't appear right, to screenshot, capture it, and send it in, take a look at it for contextual and analysis and analysis based on likely provenance, and determine that this is or is not information that requires that it be brought to the attention, say, of your local election officials or your local law enforcement officials. Which, so our job is to do the analysis. We don't take it to the officials. That's up to the person who sees it and worries that it might be suspect. And that's been being rolled out to a number of states. We have started to roll that out as well to the nation's healthcare community, Nick. And the reason is for exactly the concern, Nick, that you raised, which is of the threats that concern us, we see the social media space as an attack surface to undermine institutions to create conceivably, for example, doubt as to the efficacy of testing, doubt as to the efficacy of clinical trials, to add fuel to those who might be opposed to the use of vaccinations for whatever reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I think is a tragedy and one we should work to confront and overcome.
Totally agree.
All of that being said, the highly decentralized nature of healthcare in the United States means that social media is one of the pieces of most important connecting tissue that types of connecting tissue that's available. So that is one of the things about which we are worried. The second thing, of course, is the theft of or intellectual property, undermining the integrity of intellectual property related to the development of treatments, vaccines, and clinical trials. And last but not least, ransomware, which had started to show its ugly head in the medical field before the COVID-19 emergency. There was, I think, in Alabama, a hospital chain. 5 of their hospitals were hit with ransomware, and they were unable to admit patients. That happened before COVID-19.
Right.
We certainly don't want that sort of situation to arise now.
Right.
And there is anecdotal information that it has. As a friend of mine would say, the plural of anecdote doesn't equal data. And I don't have that data at my fingertips. But what I would say is that, the theft of and attacks on intellectual property, the use of social media to undermine confidence, and the use of ransomware to hold hostage the medical facilities on which we rely. And just to add one point to it, it's not like people on the front lines who have been doing heroic work. It's not enough praise one can give people from doctors and nurses and orderlies and technicians and everybody and the people in the mechanical plants of our medical facilities. There's, it's not like their work isn't hard enough, that they should be afflicted with ransomware that would actually hold hostage the information systems on which they rely to treat sick people. Right. I think that's unforgivable. That's unforgivable, and that's an area of particular interest to us. And that's why I continue to refer people. There are recommendations, there are controls, there are architectures. Look at the HHS guidance and look particularly at the NIST guidance on this.
Yeah, and to that point, I completely agree with everything you're saying. It's totally correct. And I have to say, in the interview series that we're doing here, I've interviewed past CISOs or directors of cybersecurity for places like Denver Health and the Cleveland Clinic and all of that, and they really seem to be on it. I mean, one of the biggest issues that the cybersecurity staff at a hospital has, especially, and I'll give you this example in New York City, is they turned Central Park basically into a giant MASH unit. That means IoT, infrastructure spun up quickly and all of that, defending these individuals, because God forbid the infrastructure that is supporting the ventilators goes down, whatever that is. One of the big things I think that we're seeing too in this sense is, again, as I do these breaches of the week videos, is the supply chains are continuously getting hit, whether it's the medical biller that is not really adhering to good controls, or the supplier of virtually anything to this hospital. I think from stem to stern, we really have to be looking at this. One of the things, just to go back to your social media point, that I say is, we have a lot of disinformation out there. And, for example, the Internet Research Agency out of Russia, that, hit the 2016 election, Congress put out all 3,600 ads. I went through every single one of them, just looking to see what they were doing, how they were driving a wedge, and I think what they are really preying on is something that I don't think we're addressing on the social media side, which is they are preying on the confirmation bias of somebody that is, let's say, right or left or whatever you are on the political spectrum here. I think cybersecurity is agnostic to that. We all need it. But part of it is, I think, looking at countries like Finland or Taiwan, for example, that have really had an educational push for their population to say, here's how you critically think. Here's how you spot fake news. Here's how you really look at what people are doing. There's no massive 20,000 scientists are all keeping their mouth shut to spread vaccines around the world in some malicious way. And I think that's really, been causing an issue for us for us globally?
Nick, this is a very personal perspective of mine.
Mhm.
Um, and as I offer this perspective less as somebody as director of a research and development center, and maybe more as somebody who teaches as a university professor at Georgetown.
Mhm.
Um, what you said contains a lot of real pearls of wisdom, in my view. We need to double down on the quality of public education. We need to double down in this country on the quality of science education. We need to teach people how to go beyond confirmation bias, to engage in higher level thinking. I read an article recently on a model of higher level thinking and how somebody can become a true master thinker, which is to allow themselves to question, to question their own assumptions and to look at data more scientifically and empirically and question the provenance of that data and question the provenance of the information that is being spoon-fed to them.
Right.
This is a level of public education that the United States, to which the United States should aspire. It's not easy. We're not Finland or Taiwan. We're a much bigger country.
And
We
diverse.
have a much more decentralized process of public education in this country. I'm reminded, and this goes back 50, 60 years, Admiral Rickover, who was sort of the father of the nuclear navy. And my father got to work with him for a while on an early nuclear submarine, called for reform of public education in the United States to make people more aligned with scientific thinking. And that doesn't mean being a scientist. It means understanding information using the scientific method and
Right.
being able to differentiate between rumor, which is unverified, which may be coming to you from 1,000 people, but it really only has one source, and the provenance of that information is in fact not particularly sound. Being able to integrate information carefully and thoughtfully. This is a skill that can be taught, and it is a skill that I think our public education system should give, to which our public education system should give as much emphasis as possible. Oddly enough, as complex as this country is and as heterogeneous as it is, we tend to be able to get this right. We don't get it right as quickly as we'd like. What did Churchill say? Americans inevitably do the right thing after they've exhausted every other course of action.
He's not wrong.
But, and I think
Yeah.
he said that as a way of actually demonstrating admiration for this country.
Yeah.
But it also means that there can be a lot of lag time between seeing the challenge and us all getting on board in facing it.
Right.
In terms of cybersecurity, to sort of round back, as we, get ready to conclude, as we round back to the point,
Mhm.
Think about information about vulnerabilities, information about malware, information about exploits, information about controls. This is an area where the cybersecurity community can be leaders. We can demonstrate our adherence to the scientific method in how we work, as opposed to saying, hey, I heard a rumor about a piece of malware. I had a rumor about a vulnerability.
Right.
That's not how you turn the ship. That's not how you make a decision.
Right.
Sure, you might hear it, you might think about it, but the real question is, what are the means you have for getting good data about your vulnerabilities, good data about the right controls,
Mhm.
and demonstrating that we can be master thinkers in evaluating cybersecurity problems and in generating the right solutions.
Mhm.
If we can do that, I think we can set a strong example. There are some excellent people working in cybersecurity. At Georgetown, a number of my students have done startups. Some have gone into the government. One is, I have two who are my former students are Fulbright scholars. One is a Rhodes Scholar. And these people are working in cybersecurity, demonstrating excellence in cybersecurity research and thinking.
Good.
That's the level to which we should all aspire.
Right.
We won't all get there. I'm not as smart as my students, but, and I know it. And they know it too. But the issue is, if they can work at this level, we can work at this level. And if we can set an example for the country.
Right. And I think that's a great point, which actually kind of ties us back, because we've gone long here, but quite frankly, this is beyond fascinating. I could talk to you all day. Um, and in that sense, that's one of the things I like about the Cyber Threat Coalition, is that we're basically a volunteer army of more than 4,000 cybersecurity experts, pretty much worldwide, that have come together. Some of us are pretty much having this as a second job, if you will, to make sure that we are defending the hospitals and critical infrastructure. I think it's a real good thing to see. And so my question then is, how can an organization like the COVID-19 Cyber Threat Coalition help organizations like MITRE, and how can we help more? How can we also be better in that sense as well?
That's a good question, Nick. Thanks. It's a good question, and I've given it some thought. I'll tell you what I think the Cyber Threat Coalition can do. I spoke a moment ago about the need to improve the rigor, the scientific rigor, the empirical rigor that we have about data. We and other organizations are bombarded with almost undifferentiated information. And that information comes, from ISACs and ISAOs, which try to be very careful, from the media, some of which, does very careful reporting, some of which is more anecdotal, from our social networks and our professional networks. To be able to raise the level of empirical rigor and develop some methodologies for improving empirical analysis of cyber threat information would be something that the coalition could really do. And MITRE and MITRE's sponsors and MITRE's cyber professionals would benefit. Now, that's an area in which we're also working. We have a thing called the Attack Framework, ATT_CK, which takes information about cyber threats and aggregates it such that we have a model. We say, that's based on what we're seeing, this is the threat actor and this is how they act. But we rely, like everybody else, on information that is exogenous to us. Improving and strengthening the overall national ecosystem, the quality of information, the quality of analysis, fact-checking, doing a better job of checking on the provenance of that information, its origins. That's something that the Cyber Threat Coalition can do. And with 4,000 members, it's got a lot of touch points. It has a lot of contact and surface area. And hopefully with 4,000 people, it can build up enough objectivity and won't suffer, and it won't suffer from confirmation bias. Or if one or two individual members demonstrate that bias, the wisdom of the crowd within that 4,000 will help overcome it. And I think that's something that can be done, because we are all trying to consume good cyber intelligence information. Another thing that I think could be done, not just for us, but overall, is to go beyond, as somebody used to say, admiring the problem. And that is, there's plenty of threat intelligence out there. And if you go to a security operations center or a security director and say, what are you going to do with this information? Well, they say, well, you're showing me a lot of intelligence that there are problems. Is there anything you can show me that's actionable? Given this threat, what should I do? Given this vulnerability, is there a patch available? Given that this is how this threat actor operates, not only what should I expect, but what should I do about what I expect? So one thing I would say that the coalition conceivably can do is to improve I hate to use a sort of Washington made up word, actionability of threat intelligence and cyber intelligence, so that it's like that ad where somebody says, somebody says, oh, I warn you about the problem, I don't do anything about it.
Right. Right.
But people at the front lines of cybersecurity, as well as those at the executive level, they need to know what to do about it. And there's one other thing that I think the coalition could do, not just for MITRE, but for the nation in general. And that is, make sure the word about good cybersecurity gets out, not just to operators, not just to technicians, not just to engineers, not just to security directors, not just to people in security operations centers, but to chief executives, chief finance officers, chief
Yes.
technology officers, chief
Yes.
operating officers, so that they put in place the programs and resources necessary to lean forward in their enterprises, rather than saying, well, I hired a CISO, I've got this problem covered,
Right.
which is a very outdated way of looking at it. But
Right.
it was a way that people looked at it not all that long ago. That's
Right.
something else the coalition could do, is join us in the call for corporate leadership responsibility for the problem as well.
Yes. Yes, I think we are doing quite a bit. Just aside from the coalition and just coming not from the coalition but from my side of my outfit, who I am, and all of that. What you're talking about is something that I have spent years focusing on. Whether I'm on stage, talking, however I am, my target audience is never my colleagues. Typically, I go speak at those conferences, but my target is the CEO, the CFO, the people that don't understand it. And I try to build myself out as a nerd to English translator here as to why, like, when you are the CEO and you have a vision of what the next 5-10 years are, your CFO is going to fund it, your CIO is going to build that infrastructure. But what's going to keep that engine moving is the shield that we create in cybersecurity to ensure that you have that uptime, you have that viability. And I think that's something that a lot of organizations are really lacking that understanding of, and that is, so you are singing to the hills, my friend. Absolutely on that. It is such a vital thing, because this is the engine of the economy. And so if we don't understand this, and I'm not asking any CEO to sit there and turn themselves into a hacker, but they've got to understand the overall principle, framework, and concepts of what we need to do to ensure their security. But they need to understand why that is just as essential to their business as paying the electric bill every month.
Well,
It's one of those things. It really is.
the Michael Porter in the 1980s, and I think I'll have to close with this.
Sure.
Invented or made popular a phrase called information intensity.
Mhm.
And what that phrase said is that any organization could be measured by its information intensity index. And now this is the 1980s version. I'm going to give you the 2020 version. But the
Please.
information intensity said, look, either you're an organization that produces information. That's what you do. You're Dow Jones. You produce information. And therefore, the value of your enterprise and the value of your information are essentially the same.
Mhm.
If you can't produce information, your enterprise doesn't exist sensibly. Or you're a company, maybe a large aircraft manufacturer, that uses information to coordinate the supply chain of thousands and hundreds of thousands of parts that go into building an airplane. And even though your airplane is not an information product, it relies on global information infrastructure.
Mhm.
And you are a highly information intensive organization. Now let's move forward to the year 2020 and ask yourself what happens to infrastructures, electrical power infrastructure, a healthcare infrastructure, a transportation infrastructure. It doesn't just rely on cyberspace, it exists within cyberspace.
Right.
Connected vehicles drive both on the road and in cyberspace.
Mhm.
Electrical power is coordinated inside of cyberspace. It's not just connected by radios and wires that keep generators moving, synchronized. The entirety of a smart grid exists within cyberspace.
Right.
If you take a look at an airplane like the Dreamliner is in large part a large computer with, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of IP addresses that happens to have engines, a fuselage, and wings on the darn thing.
Right.
But,
Right.
Whether or not it's their avionics, their navigation, the flight control system, or the passenger entertainment system, this is not just a product that relies on IT. This is a product that is, in fact, built around IT, and it lives within its information technology infrastructure, particularly in a new air traffic control system that integrates very tightly with these aircraft. So what I would say is that in 2020 and beyond, information integrity is not just about, do you produce information or do you rely on information to produce your product? It's to what extent does your product exist within that information technology
Right.
ecosystem? I think more and more savvy CEOs and CIOs and CFOs and COOs and other C-suite executives get this point. And if they don't get this point, they'll have it driven home to them when somebody, compromises the cyberspace in which their value proposition exists.
Right.
I think it's become more important from that perspective. And that takes me back to an original point. The work that my team does on securing the nation's business infrastructure, we do so in recognition of the fact that that infrastructure doesn't just rely on cyberspace. To a large part, it exists within it.
Right. And that is an excellent point to end on.
Thank you.
I have nothing to add to that other than my complete agreement on that. And
thank you,
so,
Nick.
Sam, thank you so much for your time here. I've taken an hour plus of your time at this point, and it is greatly appreciated. If people want to follow you or MITRE or anything else, can you give us some information on where and how to follow you?
Well, both MITRE and I are on LinkedIn and on Twitter. And if you search on either LinkedIn or Twitter, you'll find both MITRE and MITRE Cyber, and you'll find me. I'm not a prolific tweeter, but I do tweet from time to time, and I do try to keep people up to speed on my thinking and what I consider to be useful developments in cybersecurity on LinkedIn. So my profiles on LinkedIn and on Twitter are both public, and the same is true of MITRE in its various parts.
That's great. And you don't have to say a lot, but when you do say something, from what I've seen, it's important and it's relevant. I think we should all listen and follow you. So with that, again, thank you very much for your time. And I hope everybody enjoyed this. I know this has been just a fascinating hour for me.
Nick, it's been a pleasure and a great interview. I want to thank you for this opportunity and hope we get to work together.
I'd love that. I would absolutely love that.
I'll look forward to it.
All right. Take care.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank
Bye.
you.